a study of death. So I took some time to think about where to even start. And like I do in a lot of my studies, I think it's just important to start out with a definition. What is death? Well, death is defined in this way. It's the irreversible cessation of all vital functions, especially as indicated by permanent stoppage of the heart, respiration, and brain activity. If somebody would, get for us Genesis 35 and verse 18. So let's just illustrate this from a passage, and then we'll move on from there. Genesis 35 and verse 18. When I started advertising this on our Facebook page, I titled the class, The Last Enemy. Because the Bible talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And you notice that's stated in the future tense. So we're going to talk about that too. And but let's start here. Somebody read this. Genesis 35:18.
And it came to pass, as her soul was in departing, before she died, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin.
Okay, this is Rachel giving birth to Benjamin. Her soul was in departing, for she died. And that's, I've used that passage of Scripture in talking to people before about death. It's a separation of the physical, or rather, I guess I'd say of the spiritual from the physical. The part of us that cannot be seen, that cannot be touched, it leaves the physical. But physically, there are a lot of things that happen. And I did a lot of reading on the processes of death and what happens within the first hour to the body, and then the second hour, and then hours 5 through 6, all the way up to hour 12. And several years ago, I was, it was about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. We were in Pensacola, and I got a call from the Escambia County Sheriff's Office from, it was from a lady who had called the Sheriff's Department to have them call me. One of our members had passed away in the home, and she was there with him. He had fallen in the living room floor, and she wanted me to come sit with her while everybody got to the scene and handled everything. And that was really the first time I'd been in a situation like that. To experience that, I've been in hospitals and stuff, and of course nursing homes and funeral homes, and I suspect as most all of us have been to some extent. But that was my first experience to have of something along those lines, to be in the home with the body there of a friend who had just passed away. In 2018, there were 17.4 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births in the United States. So this is just in connection. Death during childbirth was a lot more common than it is now for a variety of reasons. So that's 2018. Well, in the 19th century, there were about 600 deaths per 100,000 births. So we can see there's obviously been quite a substantial decrease in those deaths. Can any of you tell me what happened between the 19th century and the 21st century that really changed, that prevented so many deaths? Any ideas? Midwives? Home births?
Well, I think it was possibly the, I don't know how to say it, but the cleansing of, the germs that we were able to figure out that was causing so many deaths. We
Yeah.
cleaned real well and disinfected.
Germs.
Yeah.
In 1842, it was recommended that physicians and birth attendants wash their hands.
Yeah.
I guess that, for us that's hard to fathom, because we wash our hands, some of us wash our hands fairly regularly, don't we? Anyway, that was a major shift right there in changing the death rate at live births. So I just thought that was an interesting statistic. So James chapter 2 and verse 26, as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. So there again is that concept. Let's go to Matthew 27. We'll look at this. I find this actually pretty interesting. Let's all go to Matthew 27. Kevin, will you get John 19:30 for us, please? Matthew 27:50. So the body without the spirit is dead. And I want to show you something with the crucifixion. Matthew 27 and verse 50 says, Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, the King James says, yielded up the ghost. I have the New King James here too. And it reads, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. The word yielded up there means to send away, to let go. I've been in... oh, you have John 19:30?
When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost.
Okay, bowed his head and gave up the ghost. He released, he let it go. I've been in situations with families where a family member is telling another family member, it's okay, you can go. And I suppose we've all heard stories of people essentially hanging on until family could get to the hospital or family could get to the nursing home. And it's like within a matter of minutes, they gave up the ghost. They yielded up the spirit. I don't know how all that works. I don't suppose any of us do. But we have that taught in Scripture. Our physical body can only take so much. I mean, we know that. You think of accidents. Maybe an accident in the home. Maybe a vehicular accident. Whatever. Our bodies can only take so much damage. Can only lose so much blood. I mean, we get all this. We understand that. And we're not made to, I guess I would say, survive everything. And so we're careful. We're mindful of things and situations that we put ourselves in. Sometimes they're, things that happen, situations that arise that nothing you can do. Means of death in the Bible. I did a little research here and found some interesting things. Can any of you tell me some ways that in the Bible we have recorded that people died? We just read of one. Crucifixion. How else?
We read of some that died of old age, but now when they were old, they were old.
Old age? Okay. Beheaded? Stoned? War? Okay.
We know of one that's beheaded.
Yeah. Beheading?
At least.
Suicide? All right. Drowning? I forgot. You guys have got the notes, don't I? Don't you? I'm standing up here asking questions like you don't know what I'm talking about. You've got it right in front of you. Crushed, yeah. Well, I failed, didn't I? You're testing me and I failed. All right. Old age. Moses. I think Randy's got a bone to pick with me. I was talking about some guy that came to the office one day and said, he looked pretty old. I think he was like 60. Crushed. Samson. Absalom was stabbed. Remember, he was fleeing and got his hair caught in a thicket, and they ran him through with 3 spears. Cannibalism. Siege. A siege of a city, a walled city. What are you going to eat? Your crops are outside. They ate their children. And you know, that was prophesied that that would happen because of their sin. Hanging, Haman's gallows, crucifixion. Stephen was stoned to death. You have John the Baptizer being beheaded. You have James, Acts chapter 12, beheaded. When all the stuff years ago was going on, you recall, with ISIS, they were beheading people on a regular basis. And at that time, I started doing a lot of study on Islam and learning about their doctrines and their belief systems and their practices, not just with Muhammad and his expansion over, well, I mean, he didn't do all this. He didn't live to be 600. But over the first 600 years, their expansion was, you would almost think, miraculous as far as they expanded in the world at that time. And they did it by the sword. They cut people's heads off. And I've seen some live footage of that. It's unreal what humans will do to other humans. But that happened to Christians. Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, talks about the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus Christ. That was a common method of execution. All right. You only die once. You only die once. I know there's a lot of speculation and there's a lot of stories. If you remember a few years ago, there was a book and a movie that came out about a little boy who died and went to heaven. Y'all remember that? I don't remember what the title was or anything, but... Well, he came back out a few years later and retracted all of that. He made it up. You only die once. Now, we could speculate about near-death experiences, seeing a light, etc., things like this. Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment. Knowing the physical processes of death, okay, looking at the list in your outline, and then coupling that with what Scripture teaches, that death is the separating of the invisible from the visible. You don't die and come back and die and come back. And again, I know that I think that discussion, the danger of that discussion is it can be laced with a lot of emotion and a lot of, yeah, but I've heard kind of stuff. And that's kind of a dangerous area to go because, well, I've heard a lot of things. Doesn't make it true. So I think we need to understand that. You die one time. Your soul leaves your body, and that's it. And it happens to all of us. All right, so let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3 here. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Where is that? There it is. I was over in Isaiah. Somebody read Ecclesiastes 3, verses 19 and 20, please.
What happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath, and has no advantage over animals, all advantage. All goes to one place, all are from the dust, and all return to dust.
Is a dark, very cynical book. Well, what happens to the animals happens to us. We all go back to the dust. And you notice the language there. What was it? Man has no advantage over the animal. All is vanity. Well, animals are animals, and they don't have eternal souls. We are the only beings that were created in the image of God, and as James 3 says, in the similitude of God. It's not said of animals. But the fact of the matter is, they die, we die. Another thing that he talks about in Ecclesiastes is what happens to the rich also happens to the poor. Nobody's exempt from this. No created thing is exempt from death. Now, one commenter on here says the worst cause of death to me is sin. Now, the Bible does say, what about that? The wages of sin is death. Now, that's not always, it's not always physical. A person can be living in sin and not immediately die because they're living in sin. However, a person can be doing something sinful and in the process die. But I think there's a bigger picture there of Romans 6:23. It's not necessarily physical death. And when you read Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, Paul talks about that by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. You remember in Genesis chapter 3. Is this in your outline? I got to click. I don't remember what I put in your outline. Is Genesis 3 in there on the last slide? Okay, good. Then I'll go there. So in Genesis chapter 3, chapter 2, God told Adam, the day you eat thereof, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the English says, thou shalt surely die. Well, when Adam ate the fruit, he didn't fall over dead, did he? He was still alive. Sin was brought into the world. But what's interesting is when you dig into the Hebrew language, the English doesn't convey this fully. When you dig into the Hebrew language, it says, the day that you eat thereof, dying you shall die. And the implication of the language is, and it's played out in the text, especially in chapter 3, you're separated from the tree of life, you're kicked out of the garden, and you begin dying. It didn't happen immediately, did it? It was slow. Adam lived, 930 years? According to Genesis chapter 5. So death was introduced into the world by sin, both spiritual death and physical death. There's no question about that. So the wages of sin is death. It can be physical, but we also know that righteous people die. And sometimes righteous people die doing righteous things. All right, John the Baptizer. Why did they cut his head off? They didn't like what he had to say. It is not lawful for you to have her. I want his head on a platter. So you can die in a righteous state doing righteous things. You can die in a sinful state doing sinful things. But we need to understand the duality of that subject. Sin brought, yes, spiritual death, which is separation from God. But sin also produced physical death. Separation of body and spirit. So look just real quick. We won't take time to read all this. Go to Genesis chapter 5. I mentioned this passage kind of briefly, but so when God created Adam, put him in the garden, gave him Eve, got all the animals, of every tree of the garden you may eat, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But what was the only other tree named in the garden? The tree of life, okay? And when they sinned, do you remember what God did with the tree of life? They were expelled from the garden. And what happened? The cherubim protected it with a flaming sword. They were separated from the source of what would have kept them alive. That's why it's called the tree of life. And Adam began the process of death, physical death. So you look at Genesis chapter 5. The first 2 verses talks about God creating male and female. Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. And the days of Adam after he begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And the days of Adam who lived were 930 years, and he died. Well, he died. He physically died. And then you progress all the way through chapter 5, and you get all the way down to Noah. But throughout that text, you have so-and-so did this, had this many children, lived this many years, and he died as a consequence of sin. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings 2, and I want somebody, please, read the first 2 verses there. Kings 2, 1 and 2.
Now the days of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth, be strong,
Okay, I'm going the way of all the earth. And that phrase is actually used a few times in Scripture. And what does that imply? Everybody faces death. I'm going the way of all the earth. I think it was also Joshua that said that. I think Joshua, he's in Joshua 23.
Mary, does that also go the way of all the earth? Does that also imply that, further imply that our soul leaves and goes somewhere else? And, it's leaving earth, essentially.
That's where we're going next. The implication of what's said there, the implication is he's going somewhere, and all the earth goes in this direction. So let's look at this. Genesis 25. Good question, Forrest. Somebody read Genesis 25, verses 7. We're not going to read all of these because they all say the same thing, just about different people. Genesis 25, verses 7 and 8. Somebody.
This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, and the old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people.
So that, the implication there of going the way of all the earth, well, everybody's going somewhere, obviously. But one of the images throughout the book of Genesis particularly is these people are going to be gathered to their people. And you look at Abraham, obviously Abraham was one of those what we call heroes of faith, Hebrews chapter 11. He's mentioned, I don't know how many times outside the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, and then obviously many, many times in the New Testament. And so the implication is with all of these people, like Abraham, there's a reunion. We'll be gathered to our people. I think that's interesting language. You go down to verse 17. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he gave up the ghost. There's that phrase again. Yielded up his spirit, and died, and was gathered unto his people. And then you have these other verses too, again, dealing with other individuals. And that's another subject that we'll talk about. The next verse I have is Luke 16. We've got like 5 minutes left, but we did start 5 minutes late, so I don't know what to do about that. Let's go ahead and start. Let's go to Luke 16 and look at something here. And I guess really this starting here and going on from this point introduces another topic along the lines of death. So we know what it is physically. All right, we know, again, it's the cessation of all those vital functions of the body. And we also know it's a separation. The spirit leaves the physical and goes somewhere. And I think Luke 16 gives us some great insight into that. It's interesting what people do with Luke 16, verses 19 through 31. In fact, I heard a guy do it just the other night. So a lot of people class this as a parable. And a parable, by definition, it's a combination of the word parable is a combination of a preposition and a verb. Parabolo. And it means to lay alongside or to cast something down next to the other. And it's, the common definition we hear is it's a heavenly story with an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Got it backwards. And so people get to Luke 16 and they say, well, this isn't a parable. And you say, why is it not a parable? Because it uses somebody's name. So what? It's either a parable or this really happened. It doesn't matter if somebody's named or not. That doesn't disqualify it as a parable in some magical way. But and the people that say that it's not a parable, they have a reason, they have a doctrinal reason, they think, for saying that. It's just, well, Luke 16, beginning in verse 19. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So you've got two completely different stations in life, and living right next door to each other. Implication there. It came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. Abraham's bosom, the phrase bosom means the place between the arms. This is a place of security, a place of comfort, a place where Abraham is. And he was escorted there, how? According to the text. By the angels. I don't know how that works. But that's what the biblical text reveals. And again, whether this is a parable or a real-life event, it doesn't matter. It's still, Jesus is still teaching the truth here about your station in life and how you act, what happens at death, and then what happens after death based on what you did in life. All right? The rich man also died and was buried. That's a lot less climactic, isn't it? He died and was buried. But we're given a little more insight. Now, here's one area where the King James is I want to use the right word here, because we have to appreciate the time in which it was translated. They didn't in English use the term that we use today. Language evolves. And so you're looking at the King James Version, where was he? Okay, hell. And that's not correct. He wasn't in hell. He was in Hades. And so if you're looking at a New King James, it says that. And in being in torments in Hades. He was being tormented in Hades. As opposed to somebody being comforted. Do any of you know what the word Hades means?
That which is not seen.
That's all it means. The unseen. Lazarus, the beggar, is in the unseen. And now the rich man is in the unseen. One is in Abraham's bosom. And as you continue to look through the text, let's see here. Verse 25, he is comforted. Okay, the guy who was starving, covered in fleshly, some type of wounds all over, that had dogs licking him, now he's comforted. And the other guy's tormented. They're both in Hades. They're both in the unseen realm. And that's where we all go when we die. There are actually those who teach that Hades doesn't exist anymore. So what they're saying is the unseen realm doesn't exist anymore. Again, what people do with the Bible is pretty sorry. He cried and said, verse 24, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus. You have consciousness. And you know, that's something that's unique about humanity, is the existence not only of consciousness, but of conscience. You know, and there's a difference. Your conscience, what is your conscience? How would you describe the conscience? Moral compass? Okay. Convictions in either a good way or a bad way. What did you say? Sir? Heartfelt. Okay. Tom and Jerry. Anybody ever watch Tom and Jerry? He'll get a red cat and a white cat on his shoulders. One's got horns, one's got a halo. That's conscience. That's that struggle that we go through sometimes with our inner, you have an inner dialogue, an inner conversation with yourself. And the Bible talks quite a bit about conscience. Read Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8. You don't violate your conscience. But we also are conscious. And in death, what verse was this? Verse 24. The rich man knew who Abraham was. How? I don't know. We're not told. But he recognized him. Father, Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus. Now you know on earth that the rich man knew who that guy was that sat outside his gate all the time, because he was there all the time. He recognized him. He was conscious. That he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. Tormented. The Greek term there, adonao, means pain or distress in the body. Physical pain or distress. So in death, the spirit leaves the physical body, but after death, there is a realm of conscious existence where we are, again, aware, we recognize people, we remember things, and even Abraham said, "Son, remember." Well, if there's no consciousness after death, if you just, if when you die, that's it, why would he be told to remember? That thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. Not only do you have memory, and you have recognition of people after death, consciousness, but there's pain, there's torment, and there's comfort. So this passage teaches us quite a bit about what happens not only at death, but then what we're never told. Could Lazarus see him? And that's another interesting thing about this passage. The only thing we're told about Lazarus is he is comforted. Maybe that answers some questions that we have about other things in regard to eternity. Besides all this, between us and you, there is a great gulf fixed, permanently set. It's not going anywhere, and you can't come over here, and he can't come over there. Remember, he had requested a drip of water on his tongue because he was tormented. Well, any questions or comments? We're kind of out of time, but I didn't figure we'd get all the way through this. Any questions or comments?
He never says anything there about where Abraham answered him, does he? In that passage.
About Abraham answering the written...
Yeah, Abraham let Lazarus come to me, give me a drink of water. He doesn't ever say whether the answer was yes or no.
Yeah, it just says there's a great gulf fixed. Yeah. Can't go... at the end of verse 26, that they who would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. Yeah. All right, let's just pick up there next week. And like I said, I don't know how long this is going to last and where exactly it's going to go, but we're going to study specifically about heaven. We're going to study very specifically about hell and all that. So, all right, guys, appreciate your attention.